Agnostic Illuminations, 5 Insights on Science, Consciousness, and Transference. Written by David Lane. Narrated by Greg Smith. Why ask why? Now turning our attention directly to philosophy, we are in a better position to understand why the question, why, arises so often in human beings. In light of consciousness as a virtual simulator, any organism that can develop a mental pivot tool will have a tremendous advantage in thinking of new and unexpected strategies. A curious but hopefully useful analogy can be derived here from a well-known sport. In basketball, for instance, a seasoned player knows well how to use his or her pivot foot. Once one has finished dribbling the ball, he or she must keep one foot firmly set on the ground. The other foot, however, is free to pivot or revolve or turn, giving one options that the other foot doesn't. Asking why is consciousness's pivot foot. It allows a virtual simulator to turn and think of varying options and why they portend. It allows the mind to revolve and go into different directions. As F. Scott Fitzgerald essayed in his book The Crack-Up, the test of a first-rate intelligence is the ability to hold 2 opposed ideas in the mind at the same time and still retain the ability to function. Why is the mind's way of allowing a multiplicity of ideas to compete and hopefully respond better. Why is similar to an all-purpose function key on your laptop computer, which opens up programs that are otherwise hidden from display. But though asking why can be quite helpful in very specific situations, why does it rain in the winter and not the summer, for example, it can also serve as an unnecessary nuisance if its protestations cannot be adequately met. Perhaps this can help us better understand the wide gulf between religion and science. We have already admitted that for a virtual simulator to be highly effective, it must be able to conjure up all sorts of imagined nonsense, provided it doesn't have to always act upon such in a real-life situation. Science, religion, different approaches. Science, in other words, attempts to falsify what consciousness conjures up so as to see which model best explains reality, and in doing so, it allows for a cataloging of both its successes and failures. In this way, science can indeed progress because it has a built-in tendency to eliminate less successful theoretic conjectures. Falsification versus inviolate beliefs. Religion, on the other hand, tends to accept certain simulations above all others, without resorting to any empirical verification, and habitually substantiates such imaginary permutations as being beyond physical testing. In this way, the virtual simulation protects its integrity and truth value by pointing to a transcendent arbiter and thereby foregoing any real-world competition, lest it be eliminated by such testing. Is it merely coincidence that there are tens of thousands of religions in the world, each claiming exclusive truths, but nothing comparable in the world of science? There isn't a Japanese physics or a Tibetan physics or an American physics. There is just physics. What country you come from is secondary. Gravity is universal and doesn't have different acolytes claiming different revelations in different tongues. But which geographical region you come from in religion isn't secondary but primary, since, as every geographer knows, the gods change when you go to disparate landscapes. Virtual simulation can also be instrumental in helping us better understand why beliefs can be so powerful, even when such ideologies can be regarded as wrong-headed. Any meaning system, provided it allows one enough purpose and drive to live another day, is better than none at all. Truth lies. Our brains didn't evolve to understand the universe, but to literally eat it, as in survive the local ecosystem niche long enough to transmit one's genetic code. Thus, we have invariably conflated our appetite with truth. We don't know the truth. We simply know what it takes for us to live skillfully enough so that we don't get eaten too young. And if we live long enough, the redundancies, or secondary effects, of our enlarged cerebral cortex allow us the freedom to ponder imponderables and impute upon those mysteries all sorts of silly nonsense, with the added caveat that such idiocy will last, provided it floats our boat to live another day. Why? Because believing nonsense makes more sense, in terms of replicating strategies, than coming to grips with the random chaos from which the universe apparently arises. Tom Blake might put it this way: nature is without sentiment, but those who feel sentiments have a better chance of surviving this horror show than those who do not. Why? Because any meaning is better than no meaning, even if the universe ultimately is devoid of purpose. As Voltaire would say, in my twisted way of paraphrasing him, man would have to invent God, even if such a being didn't exist. We cannot live without purpose, even if that purpose is an adaptive fiction evolved over eons of time, designed to blind those with such sentiments from the truth that nature has no such sentiment. Too much truth and you cannot move. Too much reality and you become autistic. Which is another way of saying that Jack Nicholson was right all along. We cannot handle the truth. But the truth surely has a good way of handling us. It lies to us in order for us to live an extra day. Think about it. The truth is that the truth lies. The virtual simulator. If consciousness does indeed serve as a virtual simulator with an amplified probability feedback loop, then it should come as no surprise that one of the more promising theories arising from neuroscience concerning how the brain works is based upon Bayesian probability theory. The problem of consciousness is, as Freud rightly suspected, revealed by dreaming, since it gives us a clue about how consciousness must have first emerged. As we all know, there are several stages of awareness in our dreams, ranging from the hallucinatory and intangible impressions one might get from a severe lack of rest, to the elevated heights of lucidity when one experiences an acute sense of clarity and self-luminosity. Our waking state awareness is built upon the feeling of certainty, and to the degree that we can believe what our mind projects, the more likely we are to act upon it, rightly or wrongly. Thus, the hallmark of a heightened sense of awareness is how certain and definite it feels. This is an important feature to differentiate, since if we lacked this clarity, we would be less willing to act and to make choices. And if we hesitate in the face of real danger, a lion, a tiger, a bear, oh my, then we run the very real risk of being eaten. An awareness that couldn't make such fine-tuned adjustments would have been eliminated long ago in our ancestral past. But herein lies the problem. To the degree that consciousness works because it conflates our brain state with the current real state of the world around us, it runs the risk of not being pliable enough to adapt to a new set of circumstances. In other words, consciousness must have enough plasticity to make judgments that turn out to be wrong, provided those mistaken assumptions err on the side of being too conservative or too safe. A classic example of this, albeit wildly overstated here for our purposes, is the hypothetical case of an animator versus a non-animator. Imagine, for argument's sake, that hundreds of thousands of years ago there existed two kinds of human beings. One who tended to believe in animism, whereby ordinary objects possessed an animated or vital or soul force replete with the same kind of intentionality, though perhaps more mysterious, than we have. The other human being lacked such animating tendencies, and thus had a more limited way of deciphering the motivations or intentions of other objects. Now, let's further imagine that both of these individuals were brothers sitting around a campfire, and there was the sound of a rustling bush. The animator, given his predisposition to project, Freud's transference writ early, imagines all sorts of possibilities, and because of the emotions he attaches to each, will on average try to protect himself, and thus run and hide under the worst-case scenario. The non-animator, however, will do no such thing, and in his realist approach will most likely stay put and not animate anything whatsoever about the rustling bushes. Animator versus non-animator. Reaction versus non-reaction. Now, it may well be that the non-animator is correct much more often than the animator. Most of the time, it's just the wind against the leaves. But if the animator is right just 1/10 of the time, his conservative, though animistic approach has saved his life and thereby allowed him to live another day in order to pass on his genetic code. The non-animator, even if he was correct more often than his counterpart, ends up eaten, and thus reducing his chances to pass on his DNA. While this example is hyperbolic to the extreme, it does underline something about animism and about why such innate tendencies may have evolved in human beings. Projections are future-oriented, and any awareness that can better predict the future will be of some survival benefit. But the future is unknown, and therefore making predictions about it is inherently a probabilistic venture. As the small film Brian Byrne metaphorically put it, awareness is a poker self-reflective, chance giving itself better odds. Therefore, if consciousness arose, at least to some small measure, as a predictor of how to react to future but unknown events, then it must err on the side of caution. Otherwise, if awareness was too adventurous, whatever advantages it gained would be prematurely lost with one bad outcome. But this conservative approach of awareness would most likely only be necessary when an individual confronted what he or she perceived to be a real or certain crisis. In other words, a virtual simulator would only be cautious if it acted upon that simulation as if it were related to a real event. If, however, the virtual simulator knew or believed beforehand that the simulation wasn't going to be invoked immediately, and thus could be contemplated upon without any empirical test, then it could allow itself the freedom of a wider range of imaginings. It could, to invoke an oft-used phrase, daydream. It could fantasize. It could conjure up all sorts of nonsense, provided it wasn't forced into an early test case. Here we are starting to see what dreaming portended for waking state awareness. Dreams, by definition, are subjective conjurings that arise when we are asleep. When consciousness doesn't have to work or be called into the line of fire, it has the freedom to mix and match all sorts of images and sounds and feelings into a Picasso-like universe. This would be the precursor of a consciousness which had to act upon one of its modeling simulations. Dream first, act later. And this is apparently what consciousness has evolved to do, and why it has been such a huge advantage to Homo sapiens. Unlike other animals, which apparently do not possess Eldman's second nature, human beings can play out innumerable scenarios in the privacy and safety of their own head, with the necessary imperative that they can draw upon this rich Rolodex of imagined trajectories and select what he or she believes is the best approach or model to apply to the present circumstance or problem. To appreciate how effective and powerful this tool can be for any competitive organism, just ask yourself this question: who would you rather have fly your airplane? A pilot who has never underwent any flight simulations, or one who underwent hundreds of hours in a flight simulator? Base reality or multi-layered reality? The gist of my argument was that saying everything was caused by the physical brain may appear to be perfectly sensible in this present waking state awareness, but may in truth be completely wrong if indeed there were higher states of awareness in which this and other states were subsumed. Imagine that the only state of consciousness that existed was in fact our dream world. Further imagine that in such a state, an unusual person, we will call him Ramana, confronts you by claiming to have access to a hitherto unknown level of awareness, which he calls the waking world. Ramana further argues that all experiences within the dream state are subsumed, indeed produced, by a waking brain, which is inaccessible to dreamers. And therefore, the attempt by the majority of dream materialists to reduce the waking phenomena down to their dream stuff is completely wrong and misleading, since the truth of the situation is completely the opposite. The dream is happening because of the waking state brain in another realm, not the apparent dream brain which looks to be generating awareness from itself and from its extended environment. Ramana's ultimate point is a very simple one. While it may seem overwhelmingly clear that the dream brain causes the dream world, the fact is that a transcendent state of being is its real cause and origination. What to make of such a claim? If one were grounded in dream stuff methodologies, one might ask for some convincing evidence of such a world. Let's call this thinker Churchland. To which Ramana might reply that it was impossible to actually transport such waking stuff into the dream world. Churchland, ever the skeptic, might then rejoinder that Ramana's bold claims lack proof, and as such warrant no further attention. Or she might argue that Ramana's waking excursions were just modifications to his own dream brain, and that what he thought was higher and transcendent were neither, since his numinous experiences were the result of neural dream discharges within his own dream skull. At this juncture, Ramana may argue that to see the proof of his claim, one must be willing to do a most radical experiment. One must literally die to the dream state in order to properly access the waking state. When that happens, then Churchland will actually have the extraordinary evidence she demands. Of course, Churchland might balk at this suggestion, since dream death seems a bit extreme to prove a point. Churchland may persist and query Ramana again and say, why can't you produce something in our present state of awareness which would give us confidence that your claims are true? In addition, is it not possible that you are wrong, Ramana, since your recollection of the waking state must be recalled in and through your present dream brain? How do you possibly know that the dream brain could not produce what you wrongly believe is higher? Ramana may then point out that the certainty of an experiment rests upon an uninspected axiom, that the present form of awareness is somehow the best and final arbitrator of all other states of consciousness. Why this is so isn't an ontological fact, and if other superluminal forms of awareness do exist, then exploring them may help us contextualize our present dream state. At this stage, then Ramana could encourage Churchland to take up the experiment by using a method that he himself used, employing one's own self-awareness. Ask what is the source of such luminosity. According to Ramana, that very inquiry will lead to a deep questioning of what one takes to be real and permanent, and will eventually prompt one to emerge into the waking state, which itself is the larger context behind the dream world. In such an awakening, the erstwhile skeptic will immediately discover that dream stuff was not the real cause behind dreaming. Rather, it was a physical brain in a completely different state of awareness. In the Ramana-Churchland debate, the winner or loser in such an epistemological contest cannot be resolved outside of consciousness itself, since that is the very medium by which all such discussions are bounded within. This akin to imagining two goldfish discussing the nature of water, but not having any recourse to absenting themselves from that very medium. Transference. Could it be that in our evolutionary past, we developed a simulating consciousness that imputed upon moving objects interior states, grand and depraved, that on closer inspection don't exist? I think so. Humans are wonderful inflators, and wonderful at deflating those very same inflations, while all along forgetting that the exhaling and inhaling is all being done, mostly unconsciously, by ourselves. What happens when you pull the curtain via Toto is a sight so ordinary that it actually jars one's consciousness. A small man from Kansas speaking into a microphone shouting, "Pay no attention to that guy behind the curtain," because if you pay attention to the guy behind the tapestry, you find, well, yourself, warts and all. You find that the guy from Kansas is as clueless as yourself. When Freud recognized how patients projected upon him all sorts of nonsense, which was their own psychic discharges, daddy, lover, demon, madman. He must have also understood that the therapist was also returning these transferences with some of his own, and invariably not recognizing them as equivalent projectiles. In other words, transference is a two-way street, a give and take, a back and forth aspect of our very being. The moment I recognize transference, I create another one anew in returning my volley. Such is the weird and twisted way human consciousness has evolved, to create meanings, and purposes, and patterns, and spirit, and beings, and goblins, and saints, and all sorts of stuff, just so we can survive another day in the cycle of survival. None of it is true in an objective sense, but all of it is true as a modus operandi of how we function as conscious beings. Consciousness is inflation. Consciousness is projection. That's what simulators do.